Okay, everybody, welcome to this session on Data Cloud, and we're going to be talking about our experiences of how we've gone around implementing Data Cloud and what we believe is an approach to successfully delivering a great Data Cloud implementation. However, I'd like to kick off with actually a massive thank you for being here at Dreamforce. I've been to many Dreamforces and it's great. I've really enjoyed this one. It feels like Dreamforce has got its mojo back this year. So already looking forward to coming to next year. I'm Adrian King. I'm Chief Technology Officer at Elements.cloud. And
I'm Rick Rosler. My responsibility is integrating Data Cloud into the Elements.cloud metadata dictionary and dependencies, which you'll be seeing a bit about later.
So, I'm actually just going to run through what I hope we're going to actually get across to you during this session. So there are basically 4 key things I hope that at the end of this you'll understand why we believe these are really important. The first one is it's all about the use cases. It's very easy to get focused actually on the technology, but it's actually about the value of the use cases. The second is, you normally talk about the 80-20 rule. In this case, actually, I believe 90-10 is probably a better description. 90% of the time should be spent on planning the implementation and 10% actually on the build. Building Data Cloud is pretty easy. Making sure you're building the right thing, that's quite challenging. You really do need to understand the consumption-based pricing model that goes with Data Cloud. And finally, really talk about how important documenting what you've done, because this is not a one-shot affair. This is about building and continually building value on top of Data Cloud. So let me just talk briefly a little bit about us, because actually our background is really important to what you're going to see today. We're actually a Salesforce ISV. We provide a product which we call a change intelligence platform, which basically is there to help people make sure that they actually do build the right thing. And it consists of 3 primary components. Understand your business processes and technical architecture. Understand the metadata. We have a metadata dictionary product, and actually bring it together by linking the changes which you want to implement associated with what you're trying to do for the business and what you already have. The reason why this is important is we've used our own product to drive our Data Cloud implementation, and we believe it's been a core part of the success. However, the strategy I'm going to talk about you could do with a whole range of other technologies. It's just we believe we've built a product which really does this well. So I want to take a step back. I'm old enough that I remember when Tom Siebel basically brought the whole concept of CRM to market in the 90s, and the whole concept of 360-degree view of your customer. The reality is that until very recently with Data Cloud, we didn't have a 360-degree view of our customer. What we actually had was lots of different siloed views of our customer and the business. And we use Salesforce as our core data platform. It's where all our contact information and everything about sort of the transactional view of the contact. But we use HubSpot as our marketing automation platform. We use Gainsight for PX, the product experience platform, for tracking how people are using our product. We use a product called Docebo as our learning management platform. Really interesting insights about our customer, but in a particular slice. And our ability to actually connect those, we did a bit of sort of integration work, but in no way did we have one view of our customer. 30 years on, we had not actually achieved Tom Siebel's view of 360-degree view of our customer. Data Cloud, now this is basically our landscape today in effect. I mean, it's much more complex than that, but at the center really is Sales Cloud, and we've got the other 3 products. And we actually have other products beyond this we're integrating, such as Intercom for the chat management, etc. But for the initial point, it's this. What Data Cloud is doing is changing that fundamental architecture to Data Cloud is at the center, and we're actually bringing all of this information back now into Data Cloud to give us a 360-degree view of our customer.
Right. So this is kind of a jumping off point to the architecture discussion. But the number 1 point on our key takeaway slide is it all starts with the use case. So can you talk about the use cases that we investigated?
Absolutely. I mean, it's an interesting one because we actually found it quite hard to actually, when we first started, to get some real use cases. And I think the reason for that is not that there aren't lots of really good use cases out there, it's because we've spent the last 30 years thinking in silos of data. So we actually constantly thought about, well, we could do this with this data. Actually, we had to sort of take a step back and go, now that we've actually got genuinely connected data about the fact that associated with this context, I know what, how they've been interacting with marketing at the same time as I understand how they've been interacting with our product. We actually had to take, it took us some time to actually get a head around what are the use cases. And there were 4 that we initially started with, and I'm actually going to concentrate on one, which is actually relatively simple, but actually we've never been able to achieve this, which is we actually wanted to give a score to a contact based on their interaction with us. How many times have they used different features in our product? How much have they interacted with our marketing, been to webinars? What training have they done? Were they certified? How many cases had they raised? Had they raised feature requests on the product? Basically, how engaged were they with us and with Elements? We've never been able to do that, but we really wanted, because with that, we could then start targeting at an individual level engagement with that person. So we were pulling all the data in from here. The really, really interesting thing from here, however, was that our original use cases were what I call insight use cases. We just wanted to know more about the customer. The real value of Data Cloud is not getting insights, it's actually actioning those insights. And I think it took me personally quite a long time to get my head around what the real value of Data Cloud is. There are many data warehouses out there, and there's a reason why the Salesforce Data Cloud zero copy strategy is so important. Some of you may already have Snowflake or other platforms where you've got data warehouse. Why would you need Data Cloud? The thing that Data Cloud brings is the Salesforce environment, the execution environment, Apex, flows in particular. We're very flow heavy as an organization, but the UI, I can now bring this aggregated data and process against it using my current Salesforce platform. And that's where it gets really interesting. So as soon as we got the customer value score, actually even before we delivered the customer value score, the business was now starting to realize, can we now automatically do this? Can we send an email when this happens? Moving our marketing from being pretty broad segment based to genuinely personalized interaction with our clients. One of the first things we wanted was, if somebody had been to a webinar about a particular product feature and they hadn't used that product feature within 2 weeks, we wanted to send a personalized email to them. The other side was, if they had used that product feature a lot, we wanted to send a different one to them. But we wanted to make it very, very personal on how they were using the product, had they or hadn't they. We just hadn't been able to easily do that before. So, when we were putting this presentation together, Rick and myself laughed about that we both had fathers who'd drilled into us, measure twice, cut once. With the Data Cloud, we joke that it feels more like measure 9 times, cut once. Because if you start cutting, it's really painful to back out and start again. You really, really want to go into this absolutely certain about how you're going to do the build. So we now have an internal sort of tagline, which is measure 9 times, then cut once. Interestingly, most guides are actually focusing on build. So, phase 1 is activate Data Cloud. Phase 2, press some buttons. Yeah, okay, some people get the... And phase 3, profit. I'm afraid it doesn't work like that. You really, really have to spend time planning if you're going to get the value out of Data Cloud. Just generally, we're just doing, actually I say we, Rick was doing some research on this, and if we go that 10% of your time should be on the build and 90% on planning, if you actually start going and doing sort of search results on this, most of the emphasis is out there as on build. But really interestingly, if you actually take it to this conference here, of the 300 Data Cloud presentations, 6 are on planning and all the rest are on build. The focus, because the build's the fun part, the build's the clicky bit, the build is what gives you the end result. But actually the planning is what makes sure that you get the right end result.
And we're talking a lot about planning, obviously, during this session. I don't want to minimize the importance and the value of, going through all the data cloud trailheads, really understanding the data model, learning, how all the button clicky things work and what they do, because you really need that baseline of understanding before you start the plan. And you're going to see architecture diagrams and things that we've created, and unless you have that baseline understanding, it's not very meaningful.
Yeah.
So we were joking during the implementation of this first use case. My famous saying at Elements is, "How hard can it be?" Right? No matter what, it's like, how hard can it be? And so for this customer value score use case, we're saying, surely implementing this can't be much harder than like when we implemented, automated commission management in Salesforce.
Yeah, so my response to that was, if you're implementing Sales Cloud, over the last 25 years, getting into Salesforce is relatively easy. It's like basically, on the on-ramp onto the freeway. How it's felt implementing Data Cloud is actually a bit more like climbing the north face of the Eiger. I mean, it really is like chalk and cheese between the two environments. The point about Data Cloud is you need to be technically competent. So coming back to Rick's point is, you do need to understand Data Cloud. You do need technical competence there. But to actually climb to the top there, you absolutely need to plan how you're going to do it, and you need a team. The really interesting thing here is it's genuinely a multidisciplinary activity. Not just at the technical level, there are different technical skills, but you really are going cross-functional now. Where are you going to get the data from? Is the data good? Is the data clean? All of these things. It is a massively different sort of psychological approach to, I've been working with Salesforce for 23 years now. That's probably why I'm so grey. But actually, I love Salesforce. It's been a fantastic journey. It is easy to get going and get value. With Data Cloud, you really, really have to take a serious approach to making sure you're going to get the value out of it. So come back to planning is fundamental. Please do not start pressing buttons until you can answer at least these questions, and there are more as well, but these are the ones which we really focused on, which is, how are you going to get the data and bring it in? And we were talking to one of our clients 2 or 3 days ago who's doing a big Data Cloud implementation. And getting the data and making sure you could get the data, in their case, one of their data sources is going to be giving them over 1 billion records a year. It's streaming IoT data, and actually they did some work on that to get that down from about 25 billion records a year. What's the cost? Because, by the way, the consumption-based model has real implications when you're thinking about a use case. There are some horror stories about people not doing the planning and getting overage bills that are a bit of a shock to the CFO, let's put it that way. And it's very interesting. My own CIO who works for me, when you turn on Data Cloud, there's that checkbox which is, I will basically pay the bills. You could see the reticence to tick that box. It's like, what am I letting myself in for? Well, the way you manage that is, during the planning phase, you understand what you think it's going to cost you. And you really need to understand the value, because what are you going to get from every use case? Because from that, you can determine whether or not there is genuinely a return on investment against the cost, not just of implementation, but running this. So absolutely, there are a bunch of questions you need to be able to answer before you actually start clicking the buttons. So what's the route to a customer value score? You need to identify the source systems and data, to actually climb up the mountain to achieve the goal. You definitely need to assess data volumes, the costs, the ROI to justify it. I mean, it could easily be, we've even looked at ones where we go, is it really worth the cost of running this? We have another use case where, well, that's just blindingly obvious. There's enormous value, and actually it's a really cheap use case to run. So, you really need to understand the return on investment. You then really do need to create a very detailed data flow diagram of how data is going to flow from where the data lives today through to the result you're trying to achieve. And Rick later on is going to take you through much more detail about how to build and what those are. You then need to, in a very traditional way, it's an implementation project, create the user stories that you can give to the team to go and implement this. And then finally, you go and implement those user stories. And now we get to profit. That's where the 90% of the work is. If you're going to get to the top, actually celebrate standing on the summit and achieving the return, you really, really, really want to make sure that's where you put the 90% of the time. Because the reality is, the reality is that the implementation, the build part, is actually really quite simple. It is what Salesforce is excellent at. It is clicks, not code. You can do it. I joke about 90-10. We probably have spent significantly more than 90% on the planning, because the actual configuration, it takes a couple of days once you know what you're doing. It really is. It's not difficult. Just don't start clicking until you're ready to click. So, this is actually process mapping our own product, but this is our implementation approach. We have captured the steps that we go through in detail. We did it as we did our first cut before we started. We have refined it with our experience. That step there, that's 10%. Those which are understand the use case, do the analysis of the use case, design the use case, that's the 90% work there. But the really interesting thing about this is that it's not just these 6 boxes. Under that tab there, if you click, don't expect you to actually see this. By the way, if you want to understand more about this, come and talk to us afterwards, because all of this is publicly available. This is shareable with all of you. But we've got very detailed steps around how to do the data cleansing, worrying about the privacy issues and permissions on data. And then actually you see in the middle there's another tab. We go down into more detail. So we put a lot of thought into the steps we actually go through and what artifacts, what do we generate to actually understand as we do this. So let's just quickly touch on the steps. So the first thing is identifying the source systems and data. This is the Salesforce architecture diagram where we've actually exploded that first sort of overall view of the data systems. We spent hours on this diagram over time trying to work out the best ways that we are going to, how would we best get data in? Because there are multiple different ways of ingesting data. For Gainsight PX, we're actually writing that into S3, we're then consuming it from S3, we're doing that on a 24-hour basis. HubSpot, we're using the ingest API. For Salesforce, we're pulling that straight through with their normal connectors. But then how are we getting the data back for the different use cases? And this is actually growing. As we're doing more, this is our sort of almost overall system of record of how everything is connected. And we talk about this a lot. When we're thinking about stuff, this one diagram is incredibly valuable for us.
If you remember point number 4 from the key takeaway slide, which is document everything you do, this is one of the core pieces of documentation. And as you implement more and more data cloud use cases, this architecture diagram will grow. So it's not one architecture diagram per use case, it's your architecture diagram. And by doing your data cloud implementations kind of in a measured way, it helps you kind of fill out the blank slate, right? You start with this one thing and then you can increment over time.
Okay, really important, and we're just going to touch on, there are 2 places where you do this. We're only going to look at one of them, but assess data volumes, costs, and ROI. You'll notice there's a little eye on there. We can add additional information. One of types of information is actually structured data. So we've actually built this custom data table, we call it, where we're actually working out for each one, for both on the initial and ongoing, how much data are we going to ingest? We can start actually capturing this, modeling, and start to understand the cost. Later on in the data flow diagram, we haven't had time today to go into it, you can actually start to cost every single different operation, and there are multiple different operations with different costs. With this, actually, this is what gives my CIO confidence that we're not going to run overages. because we can't guarantee we've got 100% right, but at least it forces us to think about how much is this going to cost us, because we're actually understanding the consumption of what we are going to use in Data Cloud. Right, I'm actually going to hand over to Rick, because he's got a far better understanding of this than I have, around actually creating a detailed data flow diagram.
Yeah, if you, I don't know if anybody went to Shobi Abdi's, one of his 2 sessions on have you mapped your data sources? But this diagram is very similar to an architecture diagram that he showed. It's more detailed because this is actually being used for implementation, whereas in his discussion he was creating architecture diagrams more for communication to non-IT people. But the concept is the same. So I'm going to spend a minute kind of drilling into this. In these types of architecture diagrams, data sources are typically vertically down the page. So here you see, we talked about Data Cloud. I'm sorry, we talked about Salesforce, HubSpot, Gainsight, and so forth. And then going from left to right is the actual flow of data. So if you're familiar with Data Cloud, you know that data is ingested, right? It goes into data lake objects, right, which then flow into data model objects, and then turn into actionable things like calculated insights. So here on the right, on the left, you see the source systems, the connectors that are feeding into the data lake objects, right? These data lake objects then feed into these data model objects. In this architecture diagram, we've color-coded the custom DMOs that we're using. Best practice, try to reuse the standard DMOs because it'll make your life much simpler. So this is kind of a way for us to see that we're kind of doing the right thing. And then if we go further, there's 8 data model objects that feed into a single calculated insight, which is what calculates the contact value score. And then that feeds a copy field enrichment on the contact object, so a custom field that we've created, which is over here on the left. So that's at a high level the data flow diagram. You end up with one of these detailed diagrams for every different use case because there's going to be different data sources, different actions that you're going to be taking. We talked about the little eyes on our diagram. So in Elements.cloud, a diagram is not just a picture, it's a way to encode documentation directly into the diagram. Here, if you click on the little eye, we've done a link to the user story for this particular card. So here in the middle is the user story for creating the formula for the contact value score on the object. So user stories is kind of that last bit, climbing up the mountain before you actually start pressing buttons. So everything that I've showed you so far is all before you start pressing buttons.
So hopefully this has given you, actually,
please.
Yeah, I'll hand that back to you in a second. Hopefully this has given you a flavour of the fact that we've got a very systematic way, and there's a significantly more detail than we've gone through in here in terms of getting the planning done. But at the end, basically, we have a list of this particular use case. I think there are 14 user stories that we had to go and deliver if we were going, and we have delivered them, to deliver a contact value score on the contact. It's actually a relatively simple use case, and I would also suggest you actually start with a relatively simple use case. But by going through that, we were absolutely confident that we understood what we had to do to go and build it. The interesting thing, of course, is that we've got 4 use cases that we came up with initially. We've now got dozens of use cases how we think we can start to exploit Data Cloud. We're building on what we've done before. This is where the documentation becomes really important. One of the key parts of what we do as a business is we actually have the ability to build a metadata dictionary of the metadata in Salesforce. And the great thing about Data Cloud is that it's now basically built on the platform in terms of the definition. It has got standard metadata that defines it. So one of the key things and one of the key parts of Rick's job has been how do we extend the metadata dictionary to include the Data Cloud metadata. The reason that this is so important you understand the metadata is that anybody who knows Salesforce and understands that the dependencies between things are really challenging. You go and change one thing and 15 other things go and break. And if you don't understand those dependencies, change becomes a real problem. With Data Cloud, you have just made life more challenging for yourself. You now have data starting in Salesforce and in other systems, going through Data Cloud and emerging back into things happening in core platform. So adding a pick list value to a field can ripple through Data Cloud and go and break a flow or go and break an agent. And that person who decides to go and add a pick list field has no idea that there is a dependency 15 hops away that the business is reliant on. And that's why documenting and understanding the metadata you've created and implications is so fundamental. So back to you, Rick. Actually, I never did click, actually, didn't I? So in terms of the power of the platform.
So we've mostly been talking about the process of doing the implementation. So now we're going to switch our focus to the actual Elements.cloud product and our support for Data Cloud in that. So in Elements.cloud, if you have a normal Salesforce org, like with Sales Cloud, we'll document metadata types that you're familiar with, Apex classes, objects, fields, flows, and so forth. If you have a Data Cloud license, we add the additional Data Cloud metadata. And you can see here on the right some top-level information about your Data Cloud implementation here in this demo org. Before we drill down, I just want a quick reminder of what we're trying to do, right? So at the end of the day, we want to populate this custom contact value score field by doing a Data Cloud copy field enrichment. And the value of that is coming from this calculated insight, which in turn is being fed by these 8 data model objects, which are in turn being fed by data lake objects, and eventually these different data sources. So when we look at the Data Cloud dictionary in Elements, right, we should see things that look similar to the data flow diagram that we've seen. So here's an expansion of the data source section in the dictionary. You can see there's the AWS bucket that holds the Gainsight CSV file. There's our HubSpot data source from the ingestion API, and the standard Salesforce source that's bringing in contact, case, and the Docebo objects. If we look at data streams, which are the things that are ingesting the data from the sources into the data lake objects, you'll see all of the things that you would expect to see based on the data flow diagram. So there's case contact, the 4 pieces for the ingestion API from HubSpot, the 2 Docebo objects that we need in order to do the unified individual, and finally the CSV file from Gainsight. So those are all being documented. So the documentation is interesting, but the dependencies are the kind of the critical bit. So here I'm looking at the calculated insight, the contact value score in the metadata dictionary, and over here on the right you can see the dependencies tab in Elements, and if you open that up you can see that calculated insight uses the data from the 8 data model objects, right? And it's feeding this data action, which actually wasn't on the architecture diagram, because these data actions are dynamically created by Data Cloud when you do one of these copy field enrichments, right? So when you activate a copy field enrichment, it creates a data action and a data action target, which you typically don't know about, but we are documenting as part of this. If we go back to the data flow diagram, so other kinds of documentation that you can add. So here we've added a link back to the Salesforce data dictionary. So this is the contact object that we've documented in the Salesforce org. And if you look, there's 94 dependencies that this, because it's the contact, right? It's like one of the most used objects. So there's 94 of these. We have, in addition to the list that we saw earlier, a graphical view of the dependencies. So here's the dependency tree for the contact object. I've gone ahead and expanded the piece that's relevant for Data Cloud, which in this example is just very linear. But you can see the contact data source that feeds the data lake object to the data model object, to the calculated insight, to the data action target, and finally to the field, the contact value score field on the contact object. And if you click on that, you get our right side panel here. So this represents that field on the contact object. And if you click on the little cloud icon, it takes you directly into the Salesforce setup for that field. And then over here on the right, if you have our Chrome extension, you get the same information that you see in the Elements app. You get that in Salesforce setup. And you can go, obviously in setup, you can go directly over to the copy field enrichment screen on the setup object. So that's a lot, but that's not all. It's not all, because in Data Cloud, there are a lot of non-core data sources. So, and we've already talked about some of these. So in Elements, you can create your own reference model, and I've created one for AWS that I'm going to show. So remember, the data is coming from Gainsight, and there is an integration that runs once a day that creates a CSV file that's put into an AWS bucket, which is then ingested into Data Cloud. So here is the AWS reference model. This is the bucket. This is the CSV file. These are all of the columns in the CSV file. And we can manually create dependencies between each of these columns in the CSV file and the corresponding fields in the data lake object. So you can get kind of a complete end-to-end view all the way from your AWS bucket all the way through to data model objects and calculated insights. And yes, and so here is the dependency for the CSV file. So you can see that it's being used by that data source object. Yeah, and that's it for the Elements support for Data Cloud. So what have we seen today? So we've seen a lot, but the most important things are to always start with your use cases, working with the business. That in a sense, this is not unlike if you were implementing CPQ, right? So I don't know if anybody's done CPQ or Revenue Cloud implementations, but it requires dealing with lots of constituencies, right? Finance, legal, supply chain in some cases, right? It's a big project. And depending on your Data Cloud use case, this is similar. It's a team effort. We talked about the system architecture, which is kind of a dynamic thing that will grow over time as you add use cases. Again, can't emphasize how important it is to understand your costs. We talked a lot about the data flow diagram. So the data flow diagram is kind of the key artifact that's going to help you do the implementation, because every card in the data flow diagram, as we saw, is linked back to a use case, which can be in Elements or it can be in Jira or whatever your use case system of record is. And that's going to tell somebody exactly what they need to do, which buttons to push in order to do the implementation. Oh, and there's the user story, and then you can build. And again, not to beat a dead horse, but to beat a dead horse, you really need to do all of these things that are bracketed before you start pressing buttons. Now, having said that, we did all of this before Data Cloud was available in sandboxes. So we only had production to work with at the time. Sandboxes make it easier to press buttons. I would argue that it's still really important to do your planning, and do not forget that even though you're in a sandbox, you're still going to incur Data Cloud costs. So you have to be very careful about what data you're bringing into the sandbox while you're doing your development.
Well, I mean, one of the interesting things is we started to develop into our, and we're actually evolving the implementation methodology to work out how to filter the data down for sandboxes. What is a valid subset of data that you can bring into the sandbox to test and make sure things work? Because you do not want to bring the 5 million records in or the 400 million records in. Can I actually bring a 40,000 subset or 20 records? You know, what is the record set that's required in the sandbox to be able to validate the use case? And that's part of the planning as well, because you really do need to think about this. It's too easy to just bring a lot of data in, right, or process a lot of data.
Yeah, and we actually talked about this in the Q&A in yesterday's session about the unified individual, which in Data Cloud, at least for me, is a concept that's kind of hard for me to wrap my head around. Getting the unified individual correct is really important, and it's something that would be good to play with in a sandbox, because you can take a subset of data, a small subset, right, and then experiment with your unification rules in a sandbox to make sure that that's done, but before you move it into production.
So yeah, I mean, it's been a fascinating journey for us as a company. It's not been without its road, the odd road bump now and again, but absolutely worth doing. We're getting enormous value out of Data Cloud already, and we see a number of use cases going forward for the marketing and product, and particularly our customer success group are probably the group who are most interested in the fact that they can genuinely understand what our customers are doing and how to engage with our customers. So I'm just going to go through. We started with the 4 key points. It is about the use cases. It's very easy. I'm a technologist, so my default when I started to look at Data Cloud was to be excited by the technology. It's just technology, guys. Unless there is a reason, don't take it out of the box. 90-10, say I started at 80-20 because normal Pareto rule. It's definitely 90-10. It's nearer 95-5 actually in our case. It's absolutely worth the time to make sure you understand why you're doing it and how you're going to do it, get everybody on side, because the actual build does not take very long. We've hammered it, but understand the fact that this is a different cost model from what we're used to. And actually this applies just as much to Agentforce now. We're moving into a world where usage is going to be the driver for how much things cost us for elements of using the Salesforce platform. And then finally, do document what you've done. Otherwise, the next iteration round could be really painful, and you'll spend a lot more time on it than if you just spent a little bit of time documenting what you've done. And with that, if you want more information, QR code there to get to our Data Cloud Hub, which has got access to all our information about how we actually support Data Cloud and our experiences there. I'll leave it up there for now. I think there's some thank you slides, but I'm going to say thank you actually to all of you, and I hope this has been helpful. And we definitely have a little bit of time for some questions. I am between you and lunch probably, which is a bit of a problem. But sorry, yeah. I think, would you mind, can we go to grab the microphone actually, so that, because it's being recorded.
Okay, hi. Thanks for the good talk. Very practical. It's very small here.
You might be able to just grab the mic out.
Oh, that's okay. You showed us this diagram, I think it was the data diagram,
Yeah.
and the question I had in my mind is it per use case or is it in general? You answered it directly, but I saw, and you said it grows, but I saw that you have sort of in the arrows, you sort of have the objects in there, or what they're doing. So how does that work?
We've got the two different diagrams. We've got what we call the sort of data flow context diagram at the top level, where there's just one of those, and that grows over time.
Yeah.
The detailed DFD is one per use case. So now, the interesting thing in that is that the data flow diagram for the first use case had all the ingestion, etc. in there. The next use case we don't have similar, actually one of the use cases we've got doesn't use all of the sources, so it's a smaller diagram. But we don't actually now need to use a story to bring that data in. So the second use case, the data flow diagram might have 28 cards on it, but there are only 4 user stories because there are only 4 points on that which we now have to implement to be able to deliver that full flow of data. So that's another reason why the documentation is really, really useful, because if you know what you've already built, you can go, right, to do this use case, we're ingesting all this data, but now we actually need to do the segmentation based on this rule, therefore we've got to create a new identity resolution rule, and we've got to create the segment, and we've actually got to feed that segment into S3 because we're going to feed that back into HubSpot, which is actually one of our use cases we're working on right at the moment. So it's very much builds on what you've done before.
May I ask another question?
Now, yeah, please do.
So about the cost, so you're totally right. One of the major concerns is incurring credit costs.
Yeah.
Also in the testing, etc. And you showed us, I think, in your solution, in your product, that you have then the data rows, and I think the important information for this is how many records are in there.
In that case, it was about ingestion, but on the data flow diagram, the detailed one, you can also add on every card what the cost of basically that card is going to be. Okay. Because doing a calculated insight has a particular cost. Exactly. And yet you can add a record on that, and then you can produce all of that out into a spreadsheet.
So do you use the publicly available cost sheet and credit sort of consumption sheet from Salesforce?
You need to talk to your account exec to get what the costs are going to be for every different type, because there's an ingestion cost per million records, there are data query costs, there's calculated insight costs. I think there are 8 or 9 different costed items for processing within Data Cloud. And by being able to capture those, and say we didn't show it because it's much more complex, but on every single card, you can go and say, actually we're going to be doing generating 100,000 calculated insights effectively when we turn it on because of the initial ingestion, and then we're going to be actually processing 300 of those a day or 1,000 of those a day. Therefore, the expected ongoing cost will be X.
Thanks a lot.
It's really, really, I genuinely think it's one of the really important things this allows you to do is have confidence about the value of the use case. Zero copy, yes. So gentleman here has mentioned that zero copy, so we haven't really talked particularly about it. So we don't use any zero copy data sources, but one of the things which Salesforce is making a big thing of with Data Cloud is this idea that you can use other data sources such as Snowflake, and I know Dun & Bradstreet and things like that, and they're building a fairly big partner community of zero copy data partners, but where the data stays in the other source, and actually the data lake object is a virtual. All it is basically a query through. But every query has a cost going to the zero copy. So, even on that data lake object, if it's going to be a zero copy, you need to work out how many times you think you're going to be doing a data query to it. There is quite a lot of architecture planning that needs to go into fully understanding the implications of your approach to solve that use case. Any more questions? If not, the clock says we have 14 seconds left. So I think we've done really quite well here. Okay.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope that was useful.